Good evening and welcome to the historic sanctuary of the Fountain Street Church in Grand Rapids, Michigan. For over 150 years, Fountain Street has thrived in the heart of the community as a home for free thinkers, radical ideas, and challenging conversations that lead to revolutionary actions. My name is Cassie Veach, and I currently serve as the campus administrator here at Fountain Street. If you're part of an organization that needs space to create art, organize for justice, or provide healing for our community, our campus is available to you free of cost. Just connect with us by visiting fountainstreet.org. This is the People's Cathedral, and you are the people it was built to serve. Donations from tonight's event will benefit the work of the Palestinian Red Crescent Society. I know that our current minister, Reverend Nathan Dannison, is sorry that he was unable to make this introduction tonight, as he served as an emergency medical technician with the Red Crescent in occupied Palestine in 2008. Our congregation and community has been learning a great deal about the resilience and sacrifice of the brave individuals who provide emergency medical care to the victims of the ongoing genocide in Palestine. While serving in the village of Belin near Ramallah, Reverend Dannison was fired upon and injured by Israeli soldiers. He was rushed to safety and cared for by the people of the PRCS. He has continued to support their work ever since. Medical personnel should never, under any circumstances, become targeted casualties of militaries. The caregivers in the Red Crescent place their lives on the line every single day, caring for the victims of the ethnic cleansing in their indigenous homeland. Our congregation will also be supporting the ongoing efforts of the Middle East Children's Alliance and providing desperately needed aid to the people of Gaza. We'll be raising funds this Christmas season to send to this organization as well. Fountain Street is a place of challenging conversations. We embrace this challenge and have done so for our entire history. Thank you for your willingness to have hard conversations. We believe it is necessary, and when you're ready, we invite you to join us. No matter who you are, no matter where you are in life's journey, you are welcome here. At the conclusion of this speech, there will be an opportunity to make a free will offering. You may have received QR codes on your way in with the website, or we will pass the plate to accept cash or checks to distribute to the Palestinian Red Crescent Society. It is now my pleasure to welcome the organizer of tonight's event, the Duncan Littlefair Great Speaker Series. Here to introduce tonight's speaker, please join me in welcoming Cindy Camp.
Good evening and welcome. I'm Cindy Camp. I'm a member of the Fountain Street Church, and we want to thank you for being here tonight. Late last year, I was eating breakfast when my husband, John, alerted me to a piece in the Guardian newspaper titled, "Tired of Writing About Dead Kids? Why a U.S. State Department Worker Resigned Over Israel-Gaza Policy." The piece described the deeply courageous protest of an American diplomat who had concluded that nothing he was writing or reporting was having any meaningful impact on U.S. foreign policy. Until July of 2024, Mike Casey was a U.S. diplomat or foreign service officer who worked for over 15 years for the State Department, serving in Malaysia, Pakistan, and China. His final assignment was in Jerusalem as a deputy political counselor. Reflecting early this year on his experiences as a diplomat, Mike wrote a piece entitled, "Why I Resigned." In it, he explained, "After October 7th, I stayed as long as I felt my presence could make a difference. But as my colleagues and I were increasingly sidelined, ignored, and discredited, I decided enough was enough. Beyond frustration at my government's unwillingness to act to help improve the situation, I became simply too embarrassed to continue serving as a U.S. diplomat and knew that would not change even after I left Jerusalem. In my 20s, I too worked as a foreign service officer for the State Department. My first assignment was at the American Embassy in London, where I worked side by side with Marie Yovanovitch, managing the immigrant visa section there. Years later, I watched with a great sense of pride as she, the former American ambassador to Ukraine, testified at the Trump impeachment hearings. Her courage was inspiring and had a very public face as many of us watched those televised hearings. Mike Casey's courage is of a quieter character, but is every bit as steely, resigning from his diplomatic career as a direct response to U.S. policy in Gaza. The journalist Omar El-Akkad published a searing book earlier this year, which has just won the National Book Award for nonfiction, entitled "One Day Everyone Will Have Always Been Against This." El-Akkad writes, "The moral component of history, the most necessary component, is simply a single question asked over and over again. When it mattered, who sided with justice and who sided with power?" He continues, "What makes moments such as this one so dangerous, so clarifying, is that one way or another, everyone is forced to answer." Mike Casey continues to speak and write about Gaza, Palestine, Israel, and American foreign policy from his home here in Michigan. In addition to The Guardian, he's been featured in The Washington Post, The New York Times, Al Jazeera, CNN, HuffPost, and Democracy Now! He has been recognized by the Foreign Service Association with an award for constructive dissent for cables expressing opposition to U.S. policy submitted through an official State Department channel. Mike is a graduate of Virginia Commonwealth University and the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. Fountain Street Church is pleased to have Mike Casey here tonight for a Duncan Littlefair Great Speakers Lecture. Please join me in welcoming him to Grand Rapids, Michigan.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you all this evening here in this beautiful venue. And thank you as well, Cindy, for that very kind introduction. I'm heartened to see the turnout here on a cold Saturday in November to talk about Palestine. I should apologize in advance for the heavy subject matter of this speech, which would admittedly be more informational than inspirational. A couple of friends of mine have recently joked that I'm more of a demotivational speaker as opposed to a motivational one, but I will try my best as we go forward. I want to speak a bit tonight about basically how we got to where we are and where we go from here. I'll discuss a little bit about the history of the conflict, especially recent years, and the policies or lack of policies which led to the October 7th attack. I'll also lay out a few policy options going forward on Palestine, as well as my thoughts on what individuals can do to help. The speech is not really about me, but I'll start with a little of my own background. I grew up here in Michigan, in Gaylord, up north in the snow belt. And after high school, I had the privilege to go to West Point, as Cindy mentioned. At that time, the most exciting thing going on in the Army was peacekeeping operations in Bosnia. 9/11 happened my sophomore year and completely upended our focus. And the remainder of my college years were spent preparing for war and hearing almost daily announcements about recent graduates being killed in action, many of whom I knew personally. And this continued with my own class, which suffered the most fatalities of any graduating class since the Vietnam War. I myself spent a year in Iraq as a platoon leader during the height of the conflict there. And after almost getting killed several times, I eventually got out of the Army and joined the State Department as a Foreign Service officer. My first assignment was in Beijing, consular officer, like Cindy was. I then served on the intelligence staff for Secretaries Clinton and Kerry, which provided me with insights into the capabilities and limitations of the U.S. intelligence community. During this assignment, our ambassador, Chris Stevens, and 3 others were killed in Benghazi in Libya. Russia invaded Ukraine for the first time. A U.S. diplomat, Ann Smedinghoff, was killed handing out textbooks in Afghanistan. We evacuated our embassy personnel out of South Sudan under fire, and there were coups in both Egypt and Thailand. Foreign policy is always busy and often tragic. My next assignment was in Islamabad, in Pakistan, where I focused primarily on reporting on counterinsurgency operations in the tribal areas along the Afghan border, and providing training to the Pakistani police on bomb disposal. My reward for spending a year away from my spouse was a tour in Malaysia, where we arrived with a 4-month-old baby to report on disappearing airliners, North Korean assassinations, and Chinese naval exercises in the South China Sea. From there, following Arabic language training, we flew to Jerusalem at the height of COVID with our 2-month-old second child. My Arabic, though, is quite bad, so we'll stick with English for this evening. Before I get into our tour in Jerusalem, I wanted to discuss a brief history of the conflict. Now, when you talk about the Holy Land, you can really go back as far in time as you want to. But I want to focus mainly on the last 2 decades and the policies which led up to the current situation. Now, the modern conflict goes back about 100 years, give or take, as the British took over responsibility of administering Palestine after the defeat of the Ottoman Empire in World War I. The British government had put its support behind the Zionist movement during the war and worked to implement that policy during its rule over the Holy Land. Conflict increased between Jewish settlers, Palestinian residents, and the British, leading to the proposed 2-state solution from the UN in 1948 and the end of British rule. The British left, Israel declared itself a state, and war continued with not only those living in Palestine, but outside of it as well, leading to Jordanian control of what we now call the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and Egyptian control of the Gaza Strip, and the state of Israel covering everything else. This situation is often referred to as the pre-1967 border and is the basis of statehood aspirations for Palestinians, as renewed conflict in 1967 led to Israel occupying all of Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza. Israel repelled a surprise attack in 1973, and sporadic conflict continued with neighboring countries, particularly with Hezbollah in the north. Within Israel and Palestine, violence continued despite never-ending attempts at internationally brokered peace, including the widely acclaimed Oslo Accords in the early 90s, which are now widely regarded as a failure as they reach their 30th anniversary in 2023. Now that's a lot to cover in a few sentences, and there's a lot more to dig into during that time frame. But as I said, I wanted to focus mainly on the last 2 decades. Now, looking back at 2005, I see a lot of parallels to our current situation in Palestine, and repeating these same things are going to lead to the same results, which is a never-ending cycle of violence for both Israelis and Palestinians. In 2005, what is known as the Second Intifada, or uprising, had recently ended, closing one of the most violent chapters in the conflict. The Israeli government began a plan known as disengagement from Gaza, which involved removing all of its settlements and absolving itself of responsibility for the Strip. This situation parallels what we're seeing today, where after massive death and destruction, the Israeli government has started a partial withdrawal and decided that fixing its mess is someone else's problem. Today, that's the international community, as aid organizations rush in to help the people of Gaza and fix the damage done by Israeli bombs. Well, US bombs dropped from US planes by Israeli pilots trained in the United States, but you get the idea. In 2005, Gaza was simply handed over to the Palestinian Authority, which was the intentionally weak government created for Palestinians during the Oslo Accords. The rapid withdrawal of the Israeli military, without proper coordination with Palestinian security forces, left a power vacuum in Gaza. Militant groups clamored for power, with Hamas being the most prominent among them. We're seeing a similar situation playing out now, as Hamas seeks to violently reassert itself in Gaza against other militant groups and criminal actors, as the Israeli military begins to withdraw without any sort of transition plan in place. The Israeli government sought to portray then, as it does now, that it's no longer occupying Gaza. This is not true, of course, as even when the Israeli government withdrew from the Strip in 2005, it's always continued to occupy Gaza's airspace, its telecommunications, coastline, cyberspace, and so on. Gaza only has a 2G mobile network, for example, because the Israeli government will not allow them to have anything higher than that. It's always maintained a buffer zone in Gaza as well, which amounted to nearly 17% of Gaza's territory even before October 2023. In 2006, a national election was held in Palestine, encouraged in large part by the United States. Now, Hamas, like many terrorist organizations, is also a political movement, which won the most seats in the legislature during that election, though it fell short of a majority. Israel and the United States, along with other Western countries, refused to accept the result, and Fatah, the other main political party in Palestine, refused to agree to a unity government with Hamas. Fighting increased between the two groups, with the United States supplying weapons to Fatah to fight against Hamas. In the end, Hamas removed Fatah from Gaza, taking over governance of the Strip and its inhabitants, which is roughly 40% of Palestinians, while Fatah retained control of the West Bank. Now, a few key points here. Many who support the ongoing genocide in Gaza and the collective guilt in their mind of every man, woman, and child who lives there will often point to this election, saying that Gazans elected Hamas, and this is what they deserve. But this isn't true. First, Hamas only won majority support in one of the 5 districts of Gaza during that election. Second, Gazans did not vote for Hamas to control every lever of local government in Gaza. As I said, Hamas seized that power during a violent coup. Third, as there has been no election since, Gazans have had no opportunity to remove Hamas from power peacefully. No Palestinian under the age of 37 has ever voted in a national election, which in Gaza is over 75% of the population. Attempts to resist Hamas via protests have been brutally suppressed, and since the Israeli military has apparently been unable to defeat Hamas after 2 years of fighting, the idea that Palestinians in Gaza should have overthrown Hamas is not founded in reality. So to claim that Gazans deserve their current level of suffering because of a 2006 election is absurd. In 2007, we see the start of the blockade on Gaza, enforced by Israel and Egypt, with the full backing of the United States and others. This blockade would prove to be cruel and inhumane and affect every aspect of life in Gaza. Restrictions on imports and exports, including for fuel, reduced electricity in Gaza to less than 12 hours a day at best, usually closer to 4. Gazan fishermen were limited in the size of boat motors they could use and how far they could travel from the shore, destroying a fishing industry in Gaza. Gazans themselves cannot freely enter or exit Gaza, even for medical treatment. Items like MRI and X-ray machines were considered dual use by the Israeli government and heavily restricted. Unable to export waste or import necessary materials to deal with it, Gaza's environment grew increasingly contaminated and toxic. Unreliable electricity limited water treatment, leading to over 94% of Gaza's water being undrinkable and the need for regular discharge of untreated sewage into the Mediterranean. It's worth mentioning this blockade was also ineffective, as the Israeli military and Gaza-based militants fought several wars over the following years, which killed hundreds of Israelis and over 5,000 Palestinians in Gaza, with Hamas and other militant groups developing increasingly sophisticated rocket arsenals after each conflict. Under the Obama administration, we unfortunately saw more of the same on our policies in Israel and Palestine. There was some pushback from the administration on arms sales and expanding Israeli settlements, though the United States caved nearly every time and eventually provided the munitions and the necessary international cover to continue expanding settlements. And by diplomatic cover, I mean the United States regularly used its veto at the UN to prevent any action against Israel. There was, however, one moment at the tail end of the Obama administration where the United States abstained from a resolution on Israeli settlements, which allowed it to pass. It was a momentous occasion and represented one of the few times the United States has stood up to the Israeli government and expressed our anger at its continued efforts to prevent a peaceful solution to the conflict through never-ending settlement expansion and the violence it entails. The moment would be short-lived, however, as President Trump's first term would show a radical change in our policies and complete capitulation to nearly all of the Israeli government's demands. My main criticism of President Trump, and there are many, is that he's just not a serious person when it comes to foreign policy. There are no deep thoughts, no deliberative process to determine the best way forward, no experts put into positions to steer policies. Everything is simply made up by a small group of people with little to no experience, and even some of the few good ideas they have are executed so poorly they end up being a disaster. As I stated above, foreign policy is always busy and often tragic, and decisions taken affect real people around the world. It's not something to be conducted in a half-hearted and impulsive manner, announcing peace deals in countries you can't pronounce or even remember. Foreign policy is serious business. Nowhere demonstrated this nonsensical approach to foreign policy more than in Israel and Palestine, where the United States caved to numerous demands from the Israeli government with zero pushback or benefit to the United States. The administration embarked on a campaign which would erase decades of carefully crafted policies. Illegal Israeli settlements on stolen Palestinian land were no longer illegal, according to President Trump. The United States also recognized Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights, occupied by Israel since 1967. Most critically, President Trump moved the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem and closed the U.S. consulate in Jerusalem. All these things were very heavy diplomatic bargaining chips for a future peace agreement, but were simply given away to the Israeli government without asking anything in return. In general terms, a consulate is a small version of an embassy. It is usually a subordinate mission. The embassy is in the capital, like Beijing, and there are consulates in other cities like Shanghai and Guangzhou. The consulate in Jerusalem was different, and it operated as an independent reporting mission with a direct channel back to Washington and managed our relationship with the Palestinian people. The consulate had been in operation since 1844, when it was opened in the Old City as a consulate to manage our interests in Jerusalem with the Ottoman Empire. The current location, which is now simply an embassy annex, is still the United States' oldest occupied diplomatic facility. But the loss of history is not the main issue, as the closure represented a complete rejection of long-standing U.S. policy on a two-state solution. By closing our mission to the Palestinian people, the United States no longer recognized both parties in the conflict, or even pretended to see Palestinians as equal or worthy of their own state. Now, to be fair, the Trump administration did develop a peace plan for the conflict, but as mentioned above, it was half-baked and made with zero Palestinian input. Referred to by many as the Swiss cheese plan for its proposal to divide the West Bank into a small archipelago of Palestinian enclaves, it was roundly rejected and did not amount to much. Under the Trump administration, Israeli settlement expansion began to gather steam, far-right political parties in Israel were further strengthened, and daily violence accelerated against Palestinians. At the end of the Obama administration, the United States had taken a small stand by abstaining on a UN resolution condemning settlements. At the end of the first Trump administration, we were weighing putting our full support behind Israel's plans to annex large portions of the West Bank. A split-screen image on CNN at the time essentially summed up the administration's policy, showing U.S. officials clapping at the new opening of the embassy in Jerusalem while Israeli soldiers were shooting protesters at the Gazan fence. Enter the Biden administration and renewed hope across Palestine that this would usher in a new era, or at least return to the more tolerable status quo before President Trump. This coincides roughly with my arrival in Jerusalem at the tail end of the first Trump administration. And while there would be some positive momentum, most of Trump's actions would remain unchanged. And President Biden's unconditional support for the destructive policies of the Israeli government would help set us down the road to the October 7th attack. In the spring of 2021, we saw two significant events in Palestinian politics and society: the cancellation of a Palestinian national election and the May 2021 war in Gaza. As I said before, since 2006, there has been no Palestinian national election, and President Mahmoud Abbas remains in control of the Palestinian Authority, despite being nearly 90 years old and 20 years into a 4-year term. Abbas regularly cancels elections because he fears his party will lose, and by lose, he means anything short of the full domination his party enjoys today. As elections were planned for 2021, Abbas canceled them again, citing an unwillingness of the Israeli government to allow voting in East Jerusalem. This was an excuse, of course, as there are multiple ways to circumvent this restriction. However, the Israeli government has convinced officials in Washington that an election will lead to another Hamas victory, as it did in 2006, with disastrous consequences for Israel. Beyond the fact that Israel should not be allowed to dictate Palestinian elections, and the fact that Palestinians can vote for whoever they please, polling data and changes to election law make a Hamas victory very unlikely. In fact, the opposite is more likely, that Hamas would lose its grip on power in Gaza and enter into a divided government with other Palestinian political parties. Now, this represents the real problem for the Israeli government, and particularly Benjamin Netanyahu, who has maintained the most misguided of policies and pushed to keep Hamas in power in Gaza. For Netanyahu and other Israeli hardliners, preventing a Palestinian state or anything representing Palestinian unity is the highest priority. A Palestinian national election would show unity as one political entity and Gaza, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem as one collective Palestinian territory. Removing Hamas from full control in Gaza would also remove the excuse that Hamas's presence prevents the possibility of a peace process. They believe that Hamas occupying a few seats in the Palestinian legislature is more problematic than Hamas remaining isolated in Gaza and receiving millions of dollars from Iran each year to develop weapons and plan attacks. The United States government, of course, was unable to recognize the true intentions behind Israeli election opposition and dutifully worked to suppress Palestinian elections at Israel's behest. This situation puts Hamas in a position where it is searching for a way to move forward and capitalize on its perceived growing popularity. While not a uniform view within Hamas by any means, the group had taken steps to change its direction. In 2017, it amended its charter to remove anti-Semitic material, not to an acceptable level by any outside standard, and accepting the pre-1967 border and a two-state solution with Israel. The group even publicized its internal election process to boost its appearance as a normal political party. Hamas had hoped to capitalize on its popularity and these changes by winning some seats in the election, but without an election, it returned to its normal default, which is violence. Searching for a reason to enter conflict, Hamas found no shortage of Israeli aggressions to exploit, namely the very public eviction of families from their homes in East Jerusalem, a massive racist rally known as Flag Day in Jerusalem, and a raid on the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which saw Israeli police in the mosque firing flash grenades at people inside. Shortly afterwards, rockets began flying out of Gaza, starting an 11-day war, which would see over 250 Palestinians killed, along with 11 Israelis, and billions of dollars in damage. At the time, I myself was having knee surgery, laying unconscious in the hospital. My wife was home alone giving our kids a bath, and upon hearing the rocket siren, had to scoop them out of the tub and run into the rocket shelter. And it would not be the last time. Coinciding with this conflict, an Israeli election removed Netanyahu as the prime minister, and we had the short-lived Bennett-Lapid government, a slightly liberal-leaning coalition, which seemed willing to address some quality-of-life issues in Gaza in exchange for calm, developing what they called an understanding with Hamas. Under this agreement, we worked to improve where we could life for people in Gaza. We pushed for increased imports, particularly construction materials. We worked to expand the fishing zone, and most critically, to boost the number of work permits for Gazan laborers to work in Israel, where they would earn nearly 10 times higher wages than they do in Gaza. At the same time, Hamas enforced relative calm in Gaza, controlling its own ranks and keeping other militant groups in check for the most part. Of course, at no point in this discussion was the general well-being of Palestinians a topic. These measures were taken because they helped make Israel more secure. U.S. policy towards Palestinians is always about helping Israel, not Palestinians. Regardless of these gains, the situation in Gaza remained dire and unsustainable. We continued to report to Washington that while every easing on Gaza was welcome, it was only delaying the next conflict, not preventing it. Gaza's GDP per capita is less than most countries in sub-Saharan Africa. It imported 80 times more than it exported. And many people in Gaza, including American citizens, continued to die preventable deaths on a daily basis due to the blockade. There was one particular case of a young American girl who was 8 years old who had a form of eye cancer. We had to continually push the Israelis to grant her an exit permit to get treatment in East Jerusalem. They would sometimes grant her a permit, but only for one visit. Or they would approve her permit, but not her parents, so no one could take her to the hospital for treatment. This little girl eventually died from her illness, even though it was entirely preventable and treatable. I wish I could say her case was unusual, but it was not. A good friend of mine, who is the head of Augusta Victoria Hospital, the largest hospital in East Jerusalem, said he regularly saw patients who would have survived if they received timely treatments or even medication. He also regularly saw people with types of cancer that he'd never seen before coming out of Gaza due to its toxic environment. Despite the limited gains and some economic concessions for Gaza under this government, the situation remained miserable. The Biden administration's policy of seeking small concessions, but avoiding the larger issue, would prove deadly for both Israelis and Palestinians. Now, whenever we talk about Palestine, we need to do so holistically, which includes the West Bank and East Jerusalem, where the Biden administration policies failed as well. What many people don't realize is the state of Israel grows nearly every day, and the future state of Palestine shrinks accordingly. Almost daily, someone is evicted from a home in East Jerusalem, or their home is demolished by the Israeli authorities for lack of a building permit, which is impossible to obtain. Many families are afraid to even go to the grocery store or a doctor's appointment because settlers might occupy their home while they're gone, and they'll be made instantly homeless. These settlers are, of course, fully backed by the Israeli military and police. The United States position, as repeated regularly by Secretary Blinken, was that no family should be kicked out of their home in which they've lived for generations. Yet it happened almost every day, and there was little to no U.S. response to it, even when those evicted were American citizens. The state of Israel also grows in the West Bank almost every day via settlement expansion. The Biden administration hesitated to reverse the Trump administration decision that said settlements were not illegal to avoid hurting the Israeli government's feelings. And settlement expansion not only maintained pace, but increased, both in the number of settlers in existing settlements and the rise of new settlements, often in strategic locations which divide Palestinian communities and further decrease the possibility of a viable, contiguous Palestinian state. Whenever we had visitors from Washington, senior officials, members of Congress, we would take them up to a certain hilltop in Jerusalem where you could see a clear line between Palestinian neighborhoods in East Jerusalem and the Palestinian cities of Ramallah and Bethlehem, where the settlements are built to cut them off from their fellow citizens. Now, this expansion and occupation necessitates violence, which is inflicted daily on Palestinians. Checkpoints abound, where Palestinians are, at best, delayed and harassed, or at worst, arrested or simply shot. This also includes American citizens, including an 80-year-old man who was handcuffed, beaten, and left beside a road to die by Israeli soldiers at a checkpoint. Secretary Blinken refused to support the finding that this unit had routinely violated Palestinian human rights, which would have rendered them ineligible for U.S. assistance. Instead, they continued to receive U.S. assistance, demonstrating, as one example, that there would be no consequences from the United States for human rights abuses against Palestinians. Settlers themselves also inflict violence on Palestinians, organizing violent mobs and attacking villages, burning homes and cars, and injuring and killing Palestinians, again, including U.S. citizens, and particularly uprooting and destroying olive trees, many of which are hundreds of years old, and both economically and culturally important for Palestinians. Despite ample evidence of these crimes, including videos of known perpetrators, few, if any, suffer any consequences. The reason, of course, is because these settlers work as a proxy militia, furthering the goals of the Israeli government, while living in settlements which are government-funded and using government-provided weapons. To be clear, settler violence is state-sponsored terrorism, and there is no reason the United States should turn a blind eye to it, yet that's exactly what happened. Even this week, there were new reports of continuing and growing settler violence amidst the olive harvest season. Now, Palestinian militants and lone wolf attackers do kill Israeli settlers in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, as well as attacks in Israel itself. I can remember very vividly when a ramming attack at a bus stop in East Jerusalem killed 2 Israeli boys that are the same age as my own. The death of any innocent person, particularly children, is always tragic. My anger towards our destructive U.S. policies is also in large part because these policies make everyday Israelis less secure as well, not just Palestinians. These individuals, however, have the backing of the Israeli state when attacks do occur. Attackers are often killed on the spot or hunted down and arrested or killed within 24 hours of an attack. The same cannot be said for Israelis who attack Palestinians. Many Palestinians who are arrested often end up in administrative detention, which is a fancy term that means they're simply locked up without charges or a trial for a period ranging from days to years. While allowed under international law for exceptional circumstances, it is used regularly by the Israeli government. Hundreds of people, including children and U.S. citizens, were subjected to this practice before October 7th. The number afterwards would swell to nearly 3,500. Other countries use it too. When I was in Malaysia, there was one person held under administrative detention, and Secretary Kerry raised her case in every single meeting with the Malaysian government. During my 4 years in Jerusalem, we did not once raise this issue with the Israeli government, despite the much higher numbers. We also reported regularly on widespread abuse of Palestinian prisoners in Israeli prisons, including physical and sexual abuse involving adults and minors. And again, the issue received little comment from Washington officials, despite being a topic of significant diplomatic engagement in most countries. The Bennett-Lapid government, despite some willingness to grant economic concessions, also increased settlement expansion and the number of military operations in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. It was during one such military raid that Israeli forces killed Al Jazeera journalist and American citizen Shireen Abu Akleh in Jenin in the northern West Bank. Many of us in the mission knew her personally as a prominent journalist, and prior to October 7th, it was one of the worst days of my assignment. It became even worse days later when Israeli police attacked her funeral procession, beating her pallbearers and knocking her coffin to the ground. The United States offered no condemnation of this attack and allowed the Israeli government to rebuff even the smallest attempts to investigate her killing. A meek suggestion that the Israeli military alter its rules of engagement to reduce the number of civilian casualties resulted in outrage from the Israeli government, and the matter was quickly dropped. Again, the United States did little to slow violence against Palestinians, particularly journalists, helping to pave the way for the killing of over 250 journalists so far during the war in Gaza. 2021 was the deadliest year for Palestinians since the Second Intifada, with 2022 being the most deadly year for Palestinian children. Even before the October 7th attack, 2023 was already on pace to break both of these records. We regularly reported this to Washington, but there was little reaction to it. As long as Israel was secure, and mostly Palestinians were being killed, our officials viewed the situation as stable. The Israeli government also regularly told Washington that everything was under control. So our warnings about rising violence and the unsustainability of the situation fell on deaf ears. In any of our engagements with Palestinian officials, we were simply seeking their acquiescence to whatever the Israeli government wanted to do, insisting they continue to commit publicly to nonviolence and condemn any Palestinian violence against Israelis. But the United States offered nothing to slow violence against Palestinians, whether it be at the hands of Israeli settlers or soldiers. The United States even urged the Palestinian Authority to drop any pursuit of further state recognition at the UN or take any actions against Israel at the International Criminal Court, denying them even nonviolent means of combating Israel's ongoing occupation. The next Israeli election, in August 2022, its fourth in 5 years, I believe, brought the most right-wing government in the country's history to power. This government immediately began enacting policies which accelerated violence in Israel and Palestine even further, such as ending many of these concessions in Gaza and conducting increasingly violent and destructive raids in the West Bank, including the use of helicopters in urban areas, the destruction of roads and infrastructure, and airstrikes in city centers which had not happened for over 20 years. Loosening rules of engagement even further resulted in the deaths of countless innocent children who were shot during raids and at checkpoints. Violent Israeli settlers burned cars and homes, nearly destroying villages such as Hawara and Tur Messiah, the latter of which has a majority American population. In Gaza, the Israeli military conducted targeted assassinations of militant leaders in their homes, killing entire families and their neighbors while they slept, a move which even former Israeli military and intelligence leaders found shocking. The Israeli government also began tying more attacks in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and within Israel to Hamas leadership in Gaza, and enacting collective punishment measures against the people of Gaza, including closing all the crossings and stopping all food, water, and fuel from entering the Strip for days at a time, which sounds familiar. Washington, of course, offered weak condemnation at times, but mostly threw its full support behind all these measures, despite our reporting on the consequences of it. Officials were more concerned about proposed judicial reforms in Israel which would have eroded its democracy, rather than the Israelis and Palestinians dying on a daily basis. These actions and Washington's unconditional support would lay the groundwork for the conduct of the Israeli military after October 7th. Destructive military raids indiscriminate killing of civilians, denial of food, water, and electricity to the people of Gaza as a form of collective punishment, violent displacement of Palestinians in the West Bank, physical and sexual abuse of Palestinian prisoners. All of these things were happening before October 7th and amplified 100 times after the attack. Which brings us to that fateful day. I'll be more brief on this topic, as many of you are aware of what happened based on widespread news coverage, and I'm happy to discuss in more detail if you have any questions at the end. We were actually traveling on October 7th. My family and I were returning from a trip to Austria. Before we boarded our flight that morning, I saw news of a rocket attack from Gaza, but given how often that happened, I didn't think much of it. When we arrived in Frankfurt to try to make our connection, we found more news coming out and our connection was canceled. And as we tried to get our luggage and find a hotel room, more news came out and we started to realize that this was something a lot larger. The first shock for me were the images of Erez Crossing, which is the Israeli military facility which served as the sole crossing point between Israel and Gaza. I had visited Erez many times as part of our efforts to increase freedom of movement for Gazans. I knew many of the Israeli officers who worked there. While we didn't always agree on everything, they understood the need to ease suffering in Gaza to help reduce the likelihood of conflict and had been relatively strong partners in doing so. I would consider some of them friends rather than just contacts. The crossing had been attacked and overrun. Images in the media showed it being burned, with windows full of bullet holes and the floor covered in blood. As I searched for a playground in Frankfurt to take my kids to, I saw these images and wondered if that blood was from my friends. They did not respond to messages, and it would be months before I learned if they were still alive. I had also visited some of the kibbutzim, or small villages along the Gaza fence, previously, and met with people there to discuss the conflict. These individuals were, at the time, the most pro-Gaza and pro-peace people I had met in Israel, recognizing that an endless blockade of their neighbors was not a good policy. They had always been the first to suffer during any conflict with Gaza, as they were the victim of mortars and short-range rockets, which cannot be easily intercepted by Israel's Iron Dome system. A short tour in their village included spots where numerous community members had been killed in previous conflicts. And these small villages became the epicenter of violence on October 7th. In particular, one of my Israeli colleagues from a kibbutz called Nirim was visiting family for the Yom Kippur holiday during the attack. She was forced to hide under her kitchen table, trying to keep her new baby quiet, while she listened to Hamas militants killing her neighbors and setting fire to homes in her kibbutz. The same baby she'd brought into the office a couple weeks before that to show us. Both of them thankfully survived. Pacing around the hotel lobby, I did my best to update information for Washington on what was happening in Gaza from my phone. We drafted several reports a day on the issue, with my main contribution being updating casualty figures in Gaza, which quickly climbed into the hundreds, and then thousands, and then tens of thousands. These figures would eventually become a source of much controversy in Washington. Now, whenever there's a major conflict in your country of assignment, senior leadership quickly takes over the issue, and I put most of my focus on evacuating our local Palestinian staff and their families from Gaza. Shortly after the conflict began, Israeli airstrikes destroyed parts of Rafah Crossing, which is Gaza's only exit into Egypt. And Israeli officials publicly threatened to attack any vehicles attempting to enter or leave Rafah. This trapped our local staff and their families, roughly 700 Americans and their families, and over 2 million people in Gaza, subjecting them to electrical and communication blackouts, lack of water and food, and constant bombardment from Israeli airstrikes. Many were forced to evacuate their homes and begin moving on foot within Gaza, attempting to flee for safety, despite there being nowhere that was truly safe from attack. My own local staff member, Ayman, was one such case. Ayman and I had worked together for 2 years, documenting the political situation in Gaza. She risked her personal safety on many occasions to gather information for the United States government, including meeting with human rights activists and prominent Hamas critics. The Israeli military knew where she lived because we had shared that information with them, since she worked for us. But despite this status, her home was bombed on October 11th, burying Iman, her husband, their 2 children, and her family in the rubble. I lost communication with her. I walked onto the deck of our hotel while my wife and kids built some newly purchased Legos inside. My wife eventually came and sat with me. I put my head on her shoulder and cried. First time she'd ever seen me cry in 15 years of marriage. Now, Iman and her family survived the attack and dug their way out of the rubble. They walked through the street filled with fleeing civilians in pitch black due to the lack of power to the nearest hospital, where they were allowed to sleep on the floor for the night. The next day, they were forced to flee northern Gaza, along with the other 1.2 million people who live there due to an Israeli evacuation order. They slept on the floor of a UN training center and eventually found some family to stay with in the south. An apartment meant for 5 people now housed 25 people, with no power and limited food and water. Rationing water to less than 2 cups a day, eating canned food, they managed to survive for 3 weeks before we got them on an approved exit list as part of a large negotiation between Israel, Egypt, Qatar, and Hamas. They were forced to leave behind the very family that had sheltered them in Gaza, several of whom would later die. I managed to eventually secure refugee status for Iman and her family, and I'm happy to say they now live here in the United States, though now they live in constant fear of deportation under our current administration. My family and I eventually made our way back to Jerusalem. It was a controversial decision and angered some of our family, who felt we should have left for the United States, but Jerusalem was our home, and I felt a duty to return to help where I could. Over the next several months, we kept our bags packed, water and food stocked where we could, and did our best to shield the kids from what was happening and maintain a sense of normalcy where we could. Rocket attacks remained frequent. On many nights, we scooped our kids out of bed and carried them into the bomb shelter. Rockets exploded over the park, and we took our kids to the playground. And a restaurant dinner was interrupted as we all had to run inside due to incoming rockets. Even now, after we lived in the U.S. for more than a year, my children still tremble when they hear an unexpected siren, whether it's a noon whistle in a small town or a horn when the high school football team scores a touchdown. Suffering is not a contest, especially when it comes to children, but their experience, while traumatic, still pales in comparison to the suffering faced by children in Gaza who lack any sort of shelter, warning sirens, or missile defense systems. Excuse me. At our office, we continued to report the situation in Gaza as best we could. As I mentioned before, a main focus of mine was reporting on casualty figures. We updated them twice a day in our reports, but Washington refused to believe them. How can we believe any numbers coming from Hamas, was their response. The numbers, of course, did not come from Hamas. They came from the Palestinian Ministry of Health, which has Hamas leadership in Gaza, but remains under the purview of the larger ministry in the rest of Palestine. Numbers which we had used in every previous conflict without issue. Numbers which had been investigated by the UN, Human Rights Watch, and others after each conflict and found to be reliable. Numbers which we explained time and again how they're collected and analyzed. But in November 2023, President Biden stood in the Rose Garden and said he did not believe the numbers. And I was quite literally the person updating them every day. When the president says he does not believe what you're writing, it can be a bit demoralizing, to say the least. This incident, one of many, is what put me on the path to resignation. Several times I thought, this is it. This is where we're going to change. When I sent back images of the decomposing bodies of 5 infants in the ICU at Al-Nasser Hospital, I thought that would spur change. When we reported the bombing of the St. Porphyrius Church in Gaza, the 3rd oldest Christian church in the world, I thought things would change. When we crossed the threshold of 10,000 fatalities, I thought things would change. When we reported the first child dying of starvation in Gaza, I thought things would change. When Israeli forces killed several workers from the World Central Kitchen, or young Hind Rajab and her family, I thought things would change. Instead, the United States continued supporting everything the Israeli government did and refused to apply even the slightest amount of pressure. I stayed as long as I felt I could be helpful and steer U.S. policy on the issue. This led me to work primarily on the future of Gaza after the conflict, the day after, as it was commonly called. Drafted numerous papers and held numerous briefings with officials in Washington at both the State Department and the White House on what needed to happen, addressing the humanitarian crisis, the security situation, and future governance. All of this advice was ignored, as Washington continued to support Israeli plans to have local clans run Gaza, as they called them, essentially empowering Israeli-linked warlords to run amok after the conflict. Regardless of what we said about how this policy was impractical and immoral and would lead to increased violence and suffering for Israelis and Palestinians, Washington ignored us. Since the Israeli government had proposed it, Washington was going to go with their plan, regardless of whether it would work or not. And I submitted my resignation shortly after that. Almost 18 months later, we see a so-called ceasefire in Gaza, though roughly 300 Palestinians have been killed since its inception. Only a quarter of agreed aid has been able to enter the Strip, and Israeli forces still occupy over half of Gaza's territory. The UN Security Council recently approved Trump's peace plan, relying on a board of peace, headed by Trump, to oversee Gaza's future rather than a Palestinian government. Trump also mused a few months ago that all Palestinians should be removed from Gaza, and it should be redeveloped and operated as a US-administered Riviera of the Middle East. A proposed international security force, yet to be composed and funded, has its mandate to closely coordinate with the Israeli military, indicating its purpose again is to aid Israel, not protect Palestinians. Billions of dollars will be required for rebuilding Gaza, likely to come from Gulf states, where President Trump and his family maintain extensive business connections. Though it's perhaps a moot point, as the past has shown that much promised aid money for Gaza never truly materializes. So where do we go from here? What sort of policy options should the United States pursue going forward? I recently wrote a paper on this issue with the Institute for Middle East Understanding, if you really want to get into the details, but here are a few of my suggestions. First, the United States should promote Palestinian human rights. Protecting human rights is, or at least was, a cornerstone of U.S. foreign policy, and Palestine should not be an exception. The United States cannot overlook issues such as administrative detention and prisoner abuse by the Israeli government against Palestinians. American diplomats are not able to meet with many of the most prominent human rights groups in Palestine because they are critical of the Israeli government, which is the exact reason diplomats need to meet with them. At the same time, our current administration has put sanctions on Palestinian human rights groups that are supporting cases against Israel at the International Criminal Court, which is exactly the type of activity that human rights groups can and should do. And sanctioning them is the complete opposite of what an effective U.S. policy should be. Second, settlement expansion and displacement of Palestinians needs to end. As I stated above, settler violence is state-sponsored terrorism, and there is no U.S. interest in expanding settlements. Most administrations have condemned these practices regularly, but did little to stop them. As a start, the United States should subtract Israel's settlement budget, roughly $1.5 billion US dollars, from overall U.S. assistance, publicly reiterate that settlements are illegal under international law, and enact sanctions, visa bans, and a no-contact policy on those responsible for settlement expansion and settler violence. The United States also needs to support Palestinian national and local elections. Promoting democracy is a pillar of U.S. foreign policy, and elections are crucial to building Palestinian unity and creating a future for Palestinians. The United States cannot continue to deny Palestinians their democratic rights simply to appease the Israeli government. The United States continues to turn away from corruption, poor governance, and increasing authoritarianism from the Palestinian Authority. This stance is in large part due to Israeli government support for a Palestinian government which is weak, pliable, and a security partner in oppressing Palestinians. The United States needs to pressure the Palestinian Authority to undertake serious reforms on issues such as education, combating corruption, and security, with a focus on improving the lives of Palestinians, not simply meeting demands of the Israeli government. Lastly, the United States needs to reopen the consulate in Jerusalem. This action would demonstrate U.S. commitment to a peaceful solution to the conflict, ensure policymakers in Washington receive critical reporting on Palestinian equities, and serve as a base for an independent bilateral relationship with Palestine. There is no reason this cannot be done, but the Biden administration refused to do it as they did not want to confront the Israeli government. As an example, one official told me that it could not be done because Israel might retaliate by kicking the U.S. ambassador out of Israel. The obvious response is to kick the Israeli ambassador out of the United States. We can play hardball with Israel. As Bill Clinton once said, with some added profanity that I will skip since we're in a church, who is the superpower here? Beyond U.S. policy options, people often ask, what can I do as an individual? And here's my advice. First, what you're doing right now. Learning about the conflict and passing that knowledge along to others. Raising awareness, combating disinformation. For most people, the more they learn about this conflict, the more they see the need to support Palestinian self-determination and peace in the region. Most people have no idea what settlements are, or that the Israeli government regularly targets Christian communities. Second thing is to vote. While choosing a candidate obviously involves more than one issue, make Palestine a priority. Vote for and support candidates with positive stances on the issue. And three is to donate for immediate needs and for future change. People in Gaza are starving right now and need support. There's a voluntary donation tonight for the Red Crescent Society, which is an outstanding organization that does a lot of good work on the ground. Beyond the immediate needs, consider donations to groups that are making a difference on policy going forward. Two other individuals who resigned to the Biden administration, Josh Paul and Tariq Habash, formed a group called A New Policy, which has been doing a lot of good work advancing this cause in Washington. You don't have to give to Josh's group, but similar organizations would work as well. Thank you again for this opportunity to speak with you all, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you have. Thank you.
I'll ask a quick question, Mike, about sources of information that we can go to. I know the American press tends to present a very pro-Israel point of view. So if you have any ideas, and you know, TikTok, I think a lot of young people have been using TikTok as a source of information about Gaza and the Palestinians, but now with the sale of TikTok, that may not be such a good source. So any thoughts about that for us?
Sure. So there can be a little bit of a pro-Israel bias in U.S. media. We all know about that. You could certainly, in terms of if you're looking for actual numbers and statistics on things, the UN does put together good information. The UN, OCHA, it's called, the Office of the Coordinator for Humanitarian Affairs, puts together good information. There's actually a number, it's kind of a controversial point, but some of the biggest advocates for Palestinians are Israeli NGOs that do a lot of good work for Palestine. And there's a lot of groups, Gisha is one, Beit Salam, Breaking the Silence. There's a lot of good Israeli NGOs who not only do good work, but they're very good at putting that work together for American audiences and often do a lot of advocacy work with Congress and others. So looking for specific information, those groups are good. I mentioned Palestinian human rights groups that the United States is not allowed to meet to. Those are groups to talk to as well and to look up their information. Al-Haq is one, a few others. If you basically Google, human rights organizations considered terrorists by Israel, those groups are the ones you would want to see and to talk to. Within U.S. media is tough. Actually, some Israeli media, Haaretz and Times of Israel actually have decent coverage sometimes in that as well. Arabic media, if you look at that, but sometimes that goes a little too far in the other direction sometimes if you get information on there. So I would recommend, if you're really looking to get information on a particular topic, to look at some of those Israeli NGOs or some of those Palestinian NGOs. That's where you get your most sort of solid information. And then following those individuals on social media, and they'll post the information that you want to see. Mm-hmm.
Mike, thanks again for coming tonight. Two questions. One is following up on what you finished with. What does Israel have over the U.S. that we continue to support no matter what they do? Oh, we give them a few nasty words or something, but nothing changes, especially with Netanyahu. You can just pretty much carte blanche. And then secondly, following up with Netanyahu, what do you think his potential for continuing on his political career, even though he's a war criminal?
Mm-hmm. On the first question, I wish I knew the answer. I have thoughts on it, of course, as to why that is. It's so weird, for lack of a better term, when you meet with officials in Washington and different people that talk about Israel or Palestine, is that people just completely lose their minds. People that are normally somewhat rational individuals, when you start talking about this topic, they just go completely out into left field. And a lot of it's just a natural reaction. A lot of people just do it by default. They've always done that, and they don't think any differently. I mean, a lot of officials in Washington that I would talk to, they just that it's just government inertia, right? We move these policies forward. These weapons packages go forward. This is what we do. They're not challenging that belief in that system. Some of it is personal, because people have worked with the Israelis for many years. They still meet with them on a regular basis, and they can't accept the fact that they're coming to their office and lying to them all the time, which is a standard tenet of diplomacy, that your interlocutors are normally lying to you about everything. But for some reason on Israel, people don't want to believe that. There's a lot of lobby groups in the United States. Most of them are Christian lobby groups. They're not Jewish lobby groups, as many people say they are, which they're not. They're mostly Christian groups that push forward on that. There's a lot of domestic pressure in the United States to support Israel. And we're more, what's always interesting is we walk back things that the Israeli government does and says. If you watch Netanyahu give a speech, he'll be very direct about what they're doing in Gaza, and then the United States will come out and say, well, he didn't really mean that, and try to reel it back on him. So a lot of it is just government inertia is one reason. A lot of it is more personal. People don't want to admit that a country they've supported for all these years is actually wrong in what they're doing. President Biden was a prime example of that when he would talk about Israel, he's talking about Israel from 30, 40 years ago. And so to suddenly realize that his entire political career is now heading in a wrong direction on that stance, that he's not going to change that. There's a lot of pressure from different groups, a lot of members of Congress. And again, it's interesting. So there's a representative in the Detroit area, a guy named John James. And I know John personally. We are classmates from West Point. And John is a relatively normal person, except all of a sudden he's in Israel talking about how great everything the Israelis does, and has been putting out statements supporting everything they do. And it's like, John, what class at West Point did they teach us that that's okay? What class did they teach us that you can starve civilians and do these kind of things? There's no class on that. Like, why are you saying, what are you saying? But this is what people do when it comes to Israel. They just kind of lose their minds. Some of it's domestic pressure groups, and they go on a lot of trips to Israel. They get these very curated, it's one of the only countries I've been in where members of Congress go on visits that are not official. They're taken by different lobby groups, and that will take them there and show them things, and this is the impression that's in their mind. And so it's a very effective PR campaign by some of these groups as well. So it's a lot of different things, I think, in different directions. And it's frustrating to see that we continually go along with policies that are against our own interests in many ways. And I wish I had a better answer as to why that is, and the one thing that we could do to change that. On Netanyahu's future, it's hard to say. He's a savvy fella, and he's survived other things in the past. As the war winds down in Gaza, in theory, there's going to be more pressure to investigate what happened. My controversial opinion on October 7th is that it was primarily a hostage-taking attack. Because prisoner issues are huge within Palestinian society. Everyone in Palestine has either been a prisoner or their brother has, right? Everyone's been locked up for some reason. The leadership of Hamas have all been prisoners in Israeli jails at some point. And there's been attempts by Hamas to get more people out of prison. They have the bodies of a couple of Israeli soldiers and a couple of Israeli civilians, and they're trying to negotiate for release of prisoners, and it was not happening. And particularly the leader of Hamas, a guy named Sinwar, at the time, prisoner release is his huge thing. So I think the primary motive behind the attack was the taking of hostages to exchange for Palestinian prisoners. But what happened is they took a lot more prisoners than they thought they would. They killed a lot more people than they thought they would. There was a massive failure on the Israeli side of intelligence and defense that hasn't really been fully investigated yet. And I think as the war winds down, there's more pressure on Netanyahu and others to investigate what happened. And I think the people of Israel are ready to turn on Netanyahu and his coalition when they have the chance. And once he's out of power, I don't know how solid the case is against him in terms of his corruption case within Israel itself. I'm not sure, but I imagine he'll be on trial for that should he be taken out of power. Being on trial for being a war criminal is a little less likely given, the protection they receive from the United States and the International Criminal Court. But I think within Israel, once he's out of power, and a likely reason he would be out of power is investigations of the sort of intelligence and security failures on October 7th will then put him back on trial domestically. That's maybe a little too much detail than you wanted, but.
We have a question here.
Okay. Hi, thank you. You mentioned somewhere where you've written about your personal story and the things that you've learned, or I don't know, is there anywhere we can access your writings?
Sure, I try to put most of them on my LinkedIn profile. So if you find me on LinkedIn, you'll see them there. You Google my name plus Palestine or Gaza, a lot of interviews in that will come up as well that I've done on Al Jazeera and Democracy Now! And a few other networks, and a couple articles I've written on sort of the problematic American Christian support for Israel and that sort of thing is also out there. So some of it's just Googling things to find out. If you find me on LinkedIn, which if you look me up, I'm on there. That's how Cindy tracked me down. I try to share a lot of the information that I publish on there as well. And, or afterwards, if we talk, I can get your email and I can send you. I recently wrote a paper with the Institute for Middle East Understanding because one of my main points is that the United States doesn't have its own relationship with Palestine. It's sort of a sideshow to our relationship with Israel. And the Israelis tell us what to do in Palestine, and that's what we do. Rather than evaluating, number one, what are our own interests in Palestine? And then number two, what are the interests of Palestinians, and how do we make that happen? Which is what we would do in any country that we're in. So I recently wrote a paper on that as well. So I'd be happy to send them to you directly if you'd like. You can find my LinkedIn page on there, or if you Google it, some of them will come up as well. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. The premise of my question kind of goes back to an experience I had over 30 years ago. We knew a man from Liberia, and he told us that, when Jimmy Carter was president, he had made a deliberate attempt to have a human rights presence in embassies throughout the world. And he saw a distinct difference in Liberia, which is where he was living at the time, when Reagan came to power. So my general question is, has the United States support for human rights eroded over the years, or is that a pattern that you've seen?
Over the years, I would say no, except for what we've seen in the previous and the current Trump administration, where it's deliberately not a priority. And so the human rights report in general for Israel and the West Bank and Gaza, as we call it, we've never used the word Palestine in the US government, right? Those two reports in the past have always been the longest that we have. And I wrote them myself with my colleagues in the office. And there's so many, you go back and forth and it's 140 pages and they want to cut down to 80 pages and you're fighting back and forth on it. The most recent report was 7 pages, I believe, and simply cut out 99% of the issues and problems that are there. And now they want, what did the Secretary Rubio came out the other day saying they want to include number of abortions and gender affirming care that happen in different countries as human rights issues, right? Like they're trying to completely change the focus and the emphasis on it, and trying to report countries like El Salvador saying that it's, they don't have any human rights issues because that's where they want to send people to these sort of renditions to different prisons and things like that. So now there's a very deliberate downplaying of human rights. You can argue at different times that it was not the main focus of the United States, but we still worked on it. We still reported on it. And the U.S. Human Rights Report was the gold standard for other countries. A lot of countries other diplomats you would talk to, they don't write a human rights report because they would just use ours, right, that we produced from the United States. So while it's ebbed and flowed over the years, it's clearly under a very significant attack now. And I'm shocked. I shouldn't be shocked, but I am when I read some of the reports and changes that are being proposed and different things that are coming out now, that it's clearly being not only deprioritized, which probably isn't a word, but it's being actively attacked and undermined. So definitely in recent years, it certainly has.
Anyone else?
Mike, I'm curious about your assessment of the Block the Bombs legislation that's in front of the U.S. House of Representatives. I know there are a small number of co-signers. Do you see any hope for something like that? Any momentum among the American people to really push our elected officials to take a different stance?
I think so. There is some, I'm generally optimistic and hopeful by nature. It can be certainly hard when you're writing about this conflict. And I think, what will have to change in terms of, so more generally on our policies on Israel and Palestine, it's going to have to change from the United States, right? Like Israel has shown that there's nothing they can do that's going to change our mind on our policies, right? That, as someone said, unless they attack the United States with our own weapons in the United States, maybe we would change our minds then. But currently, they use U.S. weapons to kill U.S. citizens, and we are not bothered by that. So there's no triggering event that's really going to happen on that side that's going to change our policy. It's going to have to come from domestic pressure in the United States. I think there is some of that building. You see it with where the Palestinian struggle is being tied to larger sort of social justice movements. When you drive into Bethlehem, the separation wall, as soon as you come in, there's a giant mural of George Floyd that's painted on there. And, you saw protests around the world and different things like that. And within the United States, I think it's being tied to a larger social justice struggle that's making some momentum, or at least was for a time. And so I have general hope of where, prior to our last election, where we're heading on general issues in that direction, and that things may change. But is that going to be in time for Palestine, right? Is there going to be a Palestine to free in 15 years when we finally get our act together in terms of that policy? If you're sitting in East Jerusalem now worried about someone, evicting you and taking your home, what good is this policy change in the future? When it comes to Congress, it's interesting because in the past, there would have been zero support for anything along those lines. When my earlier time in Jerusalem, there was a vote at the House of Representatives on Israel, and I think 7 representatives voted against it. 428 in favor and 7 opposed, and the Israelis just lost their minds that they had these 7 people that did not vote for them. So they're used to this 100% support that they get. So the fact that we've seen a significant number of senators even put forward this legislation that is gaining some kind of support, I think it's uniquely gaining support from some right-wing individuals that are looking at it from more of a, America first perspective, right? Like we're giving billions of dollars to a country to conduct a genocide that is not in our interest, right? Like, why are we doing this? Why are we supplying this? As a general, generally the movement is taking the wrong step of pulling down, U.S. assistance to other countries, but in this case, that it could have some positive momentum. So I think that there is hope, but I can't see it getting over the threshold. Like the number of votes needed to move it forward and to move legislation forward, I don't see it in the near term unless, something very significant happens in the next election, midterms, something like that there's a significant change. But I think at least within the Democratic Party, the younger, newer side of the party is leaning more towards supporting Palestinian rights. Some of the old guard, not so much. And then as that changes over and, the old are replaced by the new, maybe there'll be a change. But so I feel the change is coming and that legislation like this does have potential in the future, but I worry it'll be too late, is my honest assessment on that.
You said that a lot of the lobbyists or lobbies in the United States pushing for Israel are Christian. Why is the Christian right so obsessed with Israel?
So there's a biblical justification for it, I guess you could say. Book of Genesis, I believe it is, that the establishment of the state of Israel is something leading towards the, not Judgment Day, what's the other day? Everybody gets lifted up in the air. The rapture, that sort of thing, right? So there's this religious justification in those minds for it. There's this, and that's where a lot of the Christian holy sites are, and people go there and they visit these churches and they see them, and so in their mind, this is Israel and this is what they need to protect. But they're just not, it's not the reality of what the situation is there on the ground. Almost all Christians in the Holy Land are Palestinians, right? Like there aren't, I can't say there are no Israeli Christians, but there are very few, right? Christianity is inherently Palestinian. Even Palestinian citizens of Israel who are practicing Christians there. If you go to Nazareth, everyone speaks Arabic in Nazareth. They don't speak Hebrew there, right? You'll see actions targeting Palestinians who are Christians. I saw it myself on Good Friday when we went down to the old city of Jerusalem. We were able to just walk in, but Palestinian families who were there are turned away by the Israeli police because they're Palestinian, even though they lived in that neighborhood for generations, right? So there's, and Israeli settlers will attack and burn churches. There's restrictions. Whenever there's a Christian event in Jerusalem, it's very restricted and policed, whereas other holidays, not so much. So there's this misconception with Israel, and that by supporting the Israeli government, you're being a good Christian, where it's actually the exact opposite. Not to mention, supporting an ongoing genocide and that sort of thing. So a lot of it's misinformation. The original foundation is a sort of biblical justification that people like Mike Huckabee, who's now our ambassador there, believe very strongly in. And some of it's more just sort of like government inertia, it's just religious inertia. People just think that that's what they're supposed to do, that they're supposed to support Israel. And oddly enough, when I've had conversations with people, and you talk about settlements and you talk about these issues with Christian communities, a lot of people are open-minded and willing to reconsider their support. I just don't think they have those conversations very often. So it's, groupthink as well, I think, is part of that issue.
So it does seem like public opinion around Israel and the influence of AIPAC on elections is on more people's minds. So like the U.S. Senator, our representative, she's running for U.S. Senate, Haley Stevens, took $5.5 million from AIPAC. Alyssa Slotkin, she's taken like $650,000 from AIPAC. You can check this on Track AIPAC if you're interested. But is there a place in Congress for people who have taken from AIPAC in the past, in your opinion?
Is there what in Congress?
Is there like a future for people who have taken money for AIPAC in Congress?
I think so. I mean, I don't think, a lot of it too is the individual and how active they are. It's almost the dollar amount, right? How much money they receive and how crazy they are about it. Someone like Ted Cruz, he took a lot of heat for, on the 4th of July, he posted some like pro-Israel posts, and everyone's like, why are you posting about Israel on July 4th, right? But some like Alyssa Slotkin are more interesting, that has been at times a more nuanced voice on Gaza compared to others, even though she's received this money as well. So I don't, know how, are people going to continue to, does that money shape their opinion, or they have that opinion anyway? If they change their opinion, will the money change? Is it one or the other? Do they get the money and they have that opinion, or they have the opinion so they get that money? I think it's different for different individuals. And I think if people see the political headwinds change, that they'll change their mind and they'll shift their stance. Some people are too far gone, right? But some people that are a little more moderate, I think that there is a chance that they would flip on their position on Israel if that's what they thought. Because a politician's most important job is to get reelected, right? So if they think that's what's going to cost them the election, then I think that they'll change. So it's hard to say. This is a more general question about how much money influences politics and different people, but I think that there is room for change on there. But it's I don't know how many politicians are willing to reconcile how their support for genocide in Gaza has hurt their political chances. I think Michigan is one case in particular where it's frustrating that, because if you look at the last election in Michigan, so obviously President Trump won the presidential vote, but then Alyssa Slotkin won for the Senate. So people walked into the booth and they voted against Harris, but then for Slotkin. And what's one difference between the two of them is their stance on Gaza. Slotkin's isn't great, but she, was not an enabler of it as Kamala Harris was, right? So, when you look at everything else about them, it's pretty similar, but that's one issue on where they're different. And I don't think the Democratic Party has come to terms with that that was the issue that maybe decided the election in a couple of states. So I don't know if they've had that self-reckoning that they need to have on that topic, but I think it's playing a larger role than it has in the past, and that will maybe drive some of them to change their stance on it. At least I'm hopeful for it. A joint question?
Hi, I'm Jessie. I do a lot of Palestine work here in Grand Rapids. I just kind of wanted to make a comment in relation to your time in Jerusalem and what it's like for other people as well. My mom's cousin was born in Jerusalem and was forced from his home. His entire family was forced from his home in Jerusalem. He's Palestinian. He became a refugee and ended up in the U.S. He has recently been detained by ICE and is in the Baldwin facility, just about an hour and a half, 2 hours from here. And it's just the contradiction of being able to see you be able to fly in and out of their hometown where there is no right of return for Palestinians to Jerusalem, to West Bank, to Hebron, to Haifa, Jaffa. There's no right of return, and that's what we need. My best friend, because of the apartheid, because Palestinians cannot cross Jewish-only roads, because of the apartheid wall in Bethlehem that you talked about, he has not seen his own grandparents in over 4 years. He lives right here, Grand Rapids. I see him every day, my best friend. The last time he saw his grandfather, he had to be smuggled in the back of a taxi trunk by an Israeli ally and driven across the Jewish-only road in order to see his grandparents. He hasn't been able to see them since, along with his cousins. So it's drastically different for white men to go over to a Middle Eastern country, Palestine, that has historically been Arab, and Arabs aren't even allowed to move freely. We have different passports. Palestinians have different passports. They cannot go to certain places. They don't have the same rights. They don't have the same access to healthcare. One of my other family friends who own a grocery store that we just came from on the way here, we just talked to my friend Sarah. Her uncle was murdered because the checkpoints, the Israelis did not allow his ambulance to make it to the hospital. They stopped him there until he died and then allowed the ambulance to leave the checkpoint. This is the different circumstances. This is what we call apartheid and genocide. It's been a slow genocide since 1948. The escalation has just been the past 2 years. My friends relate to your friend, Iman. They didn't make it out of Gaza. Her family is one of the few families from the original 12 villages in Gaza. Most of the families that live in Gaza now are refugees, the 1.1 million refugees that were forced out of towns after 1940, after the Nakba, where 15,000 Palestinians were murdered in one day. 750,000 Palestinians were displaced in one day. And her aunt was not able to flee Gaza like your friend Aman. And we tried our best to get her out of Gaza for 1.5 years. We fundraised for her here in GR. She didn't make it out like your friend. Your friend had connections, but the everyday Palestinian doesn't want to leave their home. They don't want to come to the US. They don't want to be refugees. They want to live. They want to tend to their olive groves. They want to live. They want education. And that's what I want everyone to know is the contradiction between a majority of Eastern Europeans, people with European backgrounds being allowed into historical Palestine, occupied Palestine, and Palestinians who can track their families generations. I don't know how many generations you can track in your family. I don't know how many your Israeli friends can. My best friend can track 9 generations plus past, 12 generations past on his other mom's side too. And yet, he knows exactly where the house his grandfather lived, but after the Nakba, they were forced out by an Eastern European Jewish family. He still has the key to his house. They're not even allowed to go on that street because they are Arab and have Palestinian blood.
No, I agree with everything you said on that situation. And so Cindy had mentioned that myself and some colleagues won an award for a dissent cable we had written. And when that award was announced, we had to look up which dissent cable you're talking about because we wrote several of them. And One was on not evacuating more people out of Gaza, was the one that the award was for. And that was what we had pointed out was, we evacuated our staff, we evacuated American citizens, foreign nationals, but there are other people in Gaza who everyone should have a right to flee the conflict, and not even evacuating people that we had known and people we had worked with and different things like that, trying to justify why we need to evacuate more people from there. And of course that was denied. Earlier that we had written a dissent cable when Israel was allowed into the visa waiver program. And that was the main point, was there has to be reciprocity for American citizens, and there was not. And that was not going to happen in the agreement. And that was the prime example I put in there, is that if I flew into Ben Gurion Airport with another person who was also born in the US, but because their family's Palestinian, we both show up, they're going to treat them differently when they arrive versus how they would treat me. And so these issues were very apparent, and we tried to highlight them where we could for people in Washington. And the apartheid, you see it just every day when you're there. As you mentioned, that we could drive in and out of Bethlehem whenever we wanted. But if you were in Ramallah and you wanted to go to Bethlehem, you may not be able to make it, even for, Christmas Mass and different things like that. So it's, the situation is very apparent, and we tried to highlight that wherever we could on that issue. And you're right, when I talk to Iman now, that's one of her biggest struggles, is why did I get out and other people couldn't? Survival guilt that she has, which, I don't tell her to, she doesn't need to have that, but it's definitely, why are some people able to get out and other people are not? And it's a very unequal and tragic situation all around, and I agree with everything that she said.
Thank you. So I think I just want to be as clear as possible that we are walking away with the conclusions that I think that you're getting at here. From what you were saying, of course, Israel as an entity, as a state, was for the most part artificially created. In 1948, during the Nakba, during the British Mandate, thousands and thousands of Palestinians were forced off their land to make way for an ethno-state. And from what I was hearing from you, and this could be incorrect, but you would be more comfortable with what was going on there if as much critical eye was given to the Israelis as it was the Palestinians. You also mentioned that the settlers are state-sponsored violence. Well, I would argue that Israel itself is state-sponsored violence as an entire entity, because it is being sponsored by Western powers as an extension for Western capital, because it needs that foothold in the Middle East, and Israel is the greatest ally to Western capital in the Middle East. That explains why it's been so lenient, of course, towards Israel. So, through that logic, I would say that Palestinians have a legitimate right to armed struggle. Palestinians have a legitimate right to resist their own ethnic cleansing and their own genocide. And I suppose my question is, do you believe it is possible for peace to happen on Palestinian land until true justice is seized by Palestinian people? And how do you see that justice coming about?
Yeah, prospects for peace can be, a lot of people have given up. Obviously the two-state solution is what's been pushed for the last 30, 40 years, right? That's where we've gone. And that's been the bedrock of U.S. policy, at least until the Trump administration, in terms of what we're actually pushing for and what we're pursuing. Many people would say that's no longer viable based on Israeli settlement expansion that's been deliberately designed to prevent a contiguous Palestinian state. So then what is the future on that? There's a couple articles on a confederation model similar to the EU. There's talk of one state with equal rights for everyone, which is what most organizations now lean towards, that's where we would have to go in the future for any sort of equitable solution, given the conditions on the ground. I think, is there hope for a two-state solution? Perhaps. I think it would take a lot of diplomatic effort that's just not going to happen, and some significant concessions from the Israeli government that they're just not going to make. And so I think pushing for, maybe some future model that we haven't thought of yet, or the one state with equal rights model, is where we need to go and what needs to happen in the future. In terms of addressing right of return and different things like that these issues need to be brought up and put forward. And there's a lot of times when people will point out, 2008 is an example where the Israeli prime minister sat down with President Abbas and wrote sort of on a piece of paper, this is what we're willing to give up if you agree. And a boss didn't agree to it, and everyone says, well, that's where everything fell apart. It's like, well, no. Even if they had said, okay, we agree on it, they didn't talk about all these other issues in terms of rate of return and everything else. There's a lot more that goes on to that conflict that needs to be addressed. And what was frustrating with the Biden administration is there just was no peace process. There was no talk of it. There was no pressure on the Israeli government to come up with anything that would resemble any sort of solution to the conflict. I think being in this at times has brought me into some sort of, I wouldn't say conflict, but disagreements with some in the activist community, because I think when you work in government and diplomacy, you have to, the art of the possible, right? Like, this is where we are. We can't change that. Where do we go from here, right? I think we can look at, yes, we're talking about settlement expansion when really settlements have been expanding since, even before 1948, right? With the arrival of people into Palestine after World War I, right? Like, you can kind of go back as far as you want on it and talk about, there's the river to the sea, there's the two-state solution, there's different things like that. There's a lot of different ways that it could end up happening. I think the problem now is there's no negotiation on it, there's no talk on it, and that the conditions are not present for any sort of equal partnership in those talks. That if Israelis and Palestinians sat down today, that's not an equal pairing of people unless they have the backing of someone like the United States, which right now we're not that person. We're not that representative. We've never been a neutral party, but we're very much not a neutral party these days. And I think we've lost that position from our actions. And so it would take a lot of significant changes on that I don't see. I think any effort's going to have to be led by another outside country, and I don't know which country that would be. We recently saw where, France, the UK, and others would recognize the state of Palestine, but what does that mean exactly when you say we recognize the state of Palestine? Well, where is the state? What is its government? What is its borders? What is its economy? What is this? What is that? That recognition can't exist without a peace process to decide what that state looks like and where it goes from there. So I think no one else has been able to step up and negotiate that peace process because the United States has given up that role in recent years. So, it's a tough situation to figure out. And this is one conversation I had in particular with one activist where I said, well, it's a complicated situation. And she said, well, it's not complicated. The Israeli government's been stealing land, but kind of laid it all out. And I said, okay, well, then fix it. And she said, well, there's a lot of entrenched political interest in all this stuff. And I said, yeah, that sounds complicated, right? Like, it's not easy to resolve the situation, even if we can clearly identify what's right and what's wrong. And so I think that we've just abandoned the peace process in recent years. It needs to be rekindled. I don't think the United States is the party to rekindle it. And I think that the two-state solution model, if it has any support to it, is on its last legs, and we need to move more towards a one-state model with equal rights that's going to require a lot of pressure and diplomatic actions that the United States, I don't think, is ready to pursue.
Mike, I think we want to thank you very much for being here tonight. Thank you to Mike Casey for joining us. Thanks to all of you for being here. Mike, I think you'll probably stick around for a few minutes, so if anybody wants to just, stay and have a little extra conversation, let's give Mike a thank you from all of us.